Hey folks, welcome to the latest edition of the Techstrong gang. We're going to be talking about the United States government seems to want to investigate these deals between Microsoft, OpenAI, and throwing in NVIDIA for good measure. Then we're going to talk about Kubernetes because, well, it finally turned 10 years old. And next, we're going to chat about Cisco and what they're up to because it seems like they got their fingers in everything and now they're adding a little AI. We'll be back in a minute. And we're back, and we have a little special edition today. It's just me, Mike Vizard, and John Willis, who's home somewhere in Alabama. Is that right, John?
That's right. Auburn, Alabama, War Eagle.
All right. And we're going to be talking about these issues for the next 30 minutes or so. And I would love to get John's opinion. You've been following this whole AI thing from the very beginning, but we're hearing now that the FTC and some other agencies are starting to look at these deals and relationships between Microsoft and OpenAI, and now they want to throw NVIDIA, and this starts to feel a little bit like, Wintel all over again. But what's your sense of, is there a case to be made here, or are they just fishing?
The answer is both, right? I mean, it's the stakes are too high not to pay attention, right? The negative is, it's so early, right? This is I went back and I looked at some of the, what was going on for the last year or two on, what did, FTC and DOJ and they're, ever since sort of cloud computing, even like, internet, their job has been hard, right? Like, I was going back and doing some research on what's the responsibility of the FTC versus DOJ? This is classic government confusion, right? Like, and again, I'm not like an anti the government sucks at everything, right? But I'll give them their credit where credit is due. Like the world is, when it was AT&T, right? It was sort of straightforward, right? Even early on with some of the stuff they had to do with the sort of early Sun Microsystems and what was going on, and all that was a false start, right? But now, when you get into sort of cloud computing and then what Facebook is doing with advertising, and then you Google search, and even that's child's play to what we're talking about now, right? And if you look at the responsibilities, over the last at least decade, the lines were kind of blurred between FTC and DOJ. You can go back and I've read a little bit of history. So the prompt of this discussion, okay, I'm a geek. Let me go find out what's going on here. And, what's supposed to happen is FTC is mostly be more consumer related, healthcare, pharma, professional service, consumer goods. And DOJ is supposed to, it's clearly laid out, like lines of responsibility. DOJ is telco, transportation, financial services, energy, right? But then when these blurred lines started happening, it sort of shifted to, well, DOJ is more technical, so we should give them the sort of the Google search, or we should give them these things that are highly technical, and let's face it, most of the government agencies don't have the expertise really to interpret this stuff. But now you get into things like this started a couple of years ago with or at least more than a year ago, Amazon and Anthropic, Google and Anthropic. I mean, and the one in the article that we looked at, which is, Microsoft and OpenAI. And that's an interesting case, right? So all this to say, one, it's so early. It's really hard to really put sort of some type of control, and I'd like to talk a little about the difference between NIST, or government control, and OWASP. And in my opinion, NIST is, and I know this is sort of antitrust stuff, but NIST is, in my opinion, doing a terrible job. They're comparing, their findings are basically, if you read them, they sound like they're talking about Google search and what's wrong with AI, right? And all the things that can happen. Well, yeah, well, that's Google search. And OWASP is doing an amazing job. I think, the LLM top 10 is I think it's spot on. They just put out a paper. But sort of back to the, this whole thing is really complicated. So one, it's so early. Two, they don't really have the expertise. And I think that the other thing is we don't know the combinations. Like we don't know like what we think right now is a blockade. Like maybe I mean, on a Wednesday, everybody's convinced, including myself, that Microsoft is going to own this whole thing. Then Thursday, Google drops something, and you're like, oh well, maybe not. And then then you find something from Meta or this Instro, right? Like so, I like. And let me just say one thing. I was listening to this Stanford workshop, which is really interesting. Unfortunately, it's a 9-hour video, but it was a workshop that they ran to really understand all these complexities, right? Like governance issues. And they had this woman from UK, basically a chief data officer for basically what they call the CMA, Competitive Markets and Authority, right? I guess sort of like the FTC, right? And one of the things she said is the real fear here is, given the strength and the bulk of the big players, it could tip at any moment. So, like we could be feeling really calm, and then just like a couple of things by Microsoft and OpenAI could happen, and like, okay, now we're sort of locked into them controlling this world.
And like to your point, right? We got Apple floating around here too, and they're reportedly gonna do something with OpenAI, or maybe they might think twice about that now and maybe do a deal with multiple LLMs. But I'm not quite clear why we all feel the need to standardize on one particular provider. It seems like there's a lot of them and there's a lot of choices.
Yeah, I mean it's it really is sort of an ease of use thing, right? I mean, I'll be like you said, I've been using this technology. I've got now 4 clients that I'm focused on in this space, and I'm using this technology in anger. I'm doing a lot of interesting stuff, and you sort of navigate to the one that works fastest, easiest, is most reasonable price, but price is not the only indicator. And I just find, for me, I can do more with OpenAI, or I actually use OpenAI, not Microsoft. If I was running a large institution, I would probably use Azure OpenAI, because they do have guardrails. I don't need those guardrails because I'm usually designing, developing, testing, researching. But the OpenAI platform, it's just easy. And so why did Amazon win? Because it was easy. All the things you needed when you needed them were there. I was using, I'm going to say this, you guys bring me on this to be transparent about my opinion. I'm trying to work out running a thing I could build in 5 minutes on OpenAI. Now, granted, I do it through a notebook with some Python code, but I'm trying to run that on Bedrock from Amazon. And if I didn't have to do it because of some engagement I'm working on, I would not touch that thing. Like I'd wait a year to come back to look at it. And so I think, to answer your question, I think people navigate to the things that work the easiest. Especially, I can fake a great technologist. I'm not a great technologist. I'm sort of a bootstrap technologist. I can fiddle with almost any technology, but I'm not like, a 10xer, if there is such a thing in any one technology, right? So I like my technology to be pretty easy to get started and run. I do very technical stuff, but and so then to the point is, those become the winners, and that could become the tipping point.
And isn't that just competition, right? Because, hey, they do have a head start, and they are more advanced in terms of the tools and the integrations, and everybody else is just going to move down the same path. And it's not like Wintel, where there was only one choice, right? There are multiple choices. They're just not quite as good. And I can't help but wonder, I'm not sure that these organizations, going back to your first point, have actual standing in these agencies to do this, because it's the FTC. Well, the DOJ, there has to be some sort of crime or some sort of investigation. And was there? Who knows? They didn't say. And the FTC, to your point, is consumer oriented. Do you think we need to go maybe back to some sort of push through Congress, which might be impossible, to create some sort of oversight stuff for AI that has the legal authority ascribed to it?
I'm glad the not so big guy isn't on this show when you just asked that question. I can see the ghost of Alan saying, "Wait a minute, I got an opinion about them." But anyway, I think we have what we have, right? Like, and the whole thing about like the DOJ and FTC, right? They a long time ago sort of created this criteria for who controls antitrust, right? So, from my understanding, not being an expert, it doesn't actually have to be a crime for DOJ to be part of the investigation when it comes to antitrust matters. So I don't know how you change that. I think the UK is doing a great job, and I don't know as much about like their system, but that, the UK just seems to be just, better informed. I don't know if they're coming out with better solutions. So I don't know if there's some, like, again, watching this Stanford seminar on competition and AI, and it was pretty fascinating, just learning. Like, I think the idea that they, I don't know if it was a DOJ or who sponsored it. It was the Department of Justice who sponsored it. That's promoting competition AI at Stanford, and they brought in people from the EU. So like they are listening, but I don't know how you change, the institutionalized way we deal with these kind of problems, right? I don't know how. I don't see.
There are a lot of folks who are calling for an open source approach to LLMs and it's not clear to me that those LLMs are fully viable compared to the proprietary ones just yet. But is that just a moment in time? Do you think we will land on open source LLMs as kind of the de facto standard?
I think, the Llama stuff is really good. I think the open source is competitive, and we've had this discussion on previous, Techstrong gang conversations. And I think that, I think there's a positive balance that, like, as we invest, use, and responsibly try to explore what are the best options. And there's a little bit of, so yes, I think open source, it's an interesting race. Anybody who has a prediction is full of it, because, they're still talking about GPT-5 and GPT-6, right? I can't even imagine what that's going to look like, right? Or if it's going to happen or it's going to be renamed. But right now, from what I've experienced, what I see, the open source models, almost all the orchestration tools are open source. A lot of the vector databases are open source. So a lot of the scaffolding to get this to work. In fact, almost all the code around how you load data in, how you create semantics around, like, that's all open source. So even though, like, the frontier models, like the OpenAI, the Anthropic, Cohere, are all, I think Cohere, I'm sure that they're all proprietary. I know the OpenAI and the Anthropic are, but like, even though they're sort of strong problems, like, all the scaffolding to get this stuff to work is all open source. I mean, the models are the sort of meat, but the truth is, and then there's one other sort of, I think, sort of defense against sort of like the winner take all is a lot of companies, and I think rightfully so, are still concerned about using SaaS-based, LLMs, because I don't think it's absolutely clear that they can protect your data. They'll say in the license agreement, we don't train on your data. I think there are so many hidden dragons in the way. Because here's the thing, OpenAI. I know a little bit about more than OpenAI, but I do know a little bit about Anthropic. Is that if you look at their infrastructure, they're all basically the same. They're all running Kubernetes. They're running things like Redis. They're running all these open source stack technologies. They have to run that stuff at scale, like, and so like, we've already seen some weird manifestations of, like, Python libraries that sort of have a vulnerability, or it wasn't even like a bad actor. It was just the code started, like, leaking and sharing that, buffers got overloaded, and the next thing somebody else's data is showing up on an OpenAI, on somebody else's ChatGPT, right? So we have no idea. And so, long story short, there's a lot of large corporations that are still not convinced that it's safe to allow other than go finding the best restaurant at your corporate headquarters, chatbots to put, real sensitive, high consequence data in these SaaS models. So that pushes the open source as well, right? That pushes the sort of the meta, and some of these, these different open source tools. Now you got to run on-prem, right? And you run on-prem. And I saw something the other day where somebody was showing the cost model of even with getting your own GPUs and your own sort of technology on-prem, hosted somewhere, in a sort of a service provider. But overall, depending on your use patterns, it was actually cheaper than running on like Azure, OpenAI. So that's going to also push the gravity towards open source, is that it's still not clear, what you can and what you should and what your regulatory. I mean, we haven't even got into discussions. Like they're still trying to figure out antitrust and competition issues. I mean, I don't think they've even gotten close to like regulatory control. I mean, there is some discussions about like early discussions about banking, but like as complicated it is about antitrust, it's like an order of magnitude more complicated to figure out what technologies, how fast they're moving, what it looks like today, how do you put regulatory control. And look how long it took to get regulatory control just using clouds for banks. Mm-hmm. And that's just our computer storage.
Well, I don't think any of us know how this is all going to turn out, but I kind of wish they would just cut to the chase and get to that operating agreement that they came up with for Wintel and all that stuff back in the day and use that as a model because, uncertainty is bad for everybody. So we already kind of know what the outcome's going to be. So let's just get there sooner than later. Hey, folks, thanks for talking with us about this particular topic, but we're going to move on to what John just talked about in a minute, Kubernetes. We'll be back in a second.
Cloud Native Now is the web's leading resource for the growing cloud native ecosystem. CloudNativeNow.com is your destination for news, thought leadership, features, and webinars on cloud native architecture, Kubernetes, serverless, cloud native application development, microservices, service mesh, cloud native security, and more. Stay on the cutting edge of modern application development at Cloud Native Now.
All right, folks, and we're back, and we're talking about Kubernetes because, it's having a moment. Last week, it celebrated its 10th birthday. Who would have thought? It's an interesting thing, though. Early on, everybody seemed to think Kubernetes was going to take over the world, and we had full-stack developers forcing IT teams to embrace it and manage it, and there was some resistance on that side, and finally, they came around to it and said, this is going to be great. We're all going to be platform engineers. And now they're trying to get the rest of the development community to sign on board for this thing. And we're encountering additional resistance because, a lot of the developers who are not full stack developers are going, hey, this thing's hard and I got to know more about infrastructure than I ever wanted to know. So we're kind of like, it's 10 years in the making, and I guess we could call it a success, but it sure feels like it's taken a long time and there's much work to be done still. John, what's your take on Kubernetes in general? Do you think it's becoming a de facto standard?
Yeah, I think it is. But like, I kind of think what you're talking about, like that. Where were you in the summer of 2014? The other point you made, right? Like there's sort of two views of this. One is it's definitely one, right? Like if you look at the history here of the competition and it's just been eradicated, right? And there's a lot, and one of the reasons it won is not just that it's just Kubernetes itself. It's it's EKS, AKS, GKS. It's the variants like Rancher. It's so what you all, if you quote unquote say, are you running Kubernetes? They would all say yes, right? But the swarms, the nomads. I thought Nomad was like come on, Nomad, you can win this race, you can do it, and even they punted. Fargate, it's getting gee, thanks. So yeah, I do think it, but the point you made, the other point I think is I'd forgotten that I stopped. I'm so AI in the brain these days. I'm like, oh, Kubernetes, do I really want to talk about that? But one of the things I think what was interesting is if you think about what Docker did, right? Docker basically engaged the developer to infrastructure in a way they had never been engaged before. The reason the world fell in love with Docker because now a developer could literally emulate almost a high percentage of what the operating environment was going to be like when their code ran. They could run in their desktop. They could simulate different containers, how they interact with services. I mean, it wasn't 100% complete, but this idea that you could create this, not just convergent infrastructure, congruent, we called it, like the chefs, the puppets, infrastructure code were all convergent, like every 15 or 30 minutes, make it look like this. But now you could actually create congruent, whereas, like, for the most part, what you ran in environment A, which could be in your laptop, ran in environment B, which was some test environment, and ran in production, was not 100% congruent, but pretty darn close. And now developers had sort of authority to operate, in a sense that they could, whether they could be controlled by risk and controlling bodies, but they could run their code pretty much the way they ran in their test environment. And that's what they always wanted. They didn't want to have to go to the ops people and say, please, can I have a little bit more storage? No, go back, the Oliver story. And then that was great. Like, that's why Docker went nuts, right? And then we say, okay, well, there is a problem with Docker. Like, how do you orchestrate it? And Kubernetes comes along. And Kubernetes is not easy for the developer. The developer can't do the full, string. Like, they either have to, sort of give up, like, part of their time to become an expert in all the things they shouldn't have to be an expert, network, compute, storage, all the complexities of, then you add the service mesh. Anyway, so I that still is the problem with Kubernetes, is I think who owns it, right? It's supposed to be seamless from both sides, the developer and the operations, and it's not. And it's never been absolutely crystal clear from a lot of the organizations I worked with is who now owns that. Like, it was clear that developer could own everything from building, for creating a code, a Docker file, creating a Docker image, deploying the Docker image. But then when you have to run it in these clusters and pods and all, and all the networking and confusion and the Kubernetes, the one last thing I'll say about this is, I think at some point I started saying the inmates are running the asylum. The people who were literally building this code at lightning speed are not actually using it. And yeah, so
there's two ironies here, right? One is, if you talk to AWS and Google, they'll tell you that there's still more code running in container platforms that don't have Kubernetes than there are ones that do have Kubernetes. And a lot of developers are probably voting with their feet and saying, I don't think I need orchestration, or I'll get by without it. And then secondarily, to your point about who's running this stuff, so we're hearing everybody talk about platform engineering teams, and it kind of raises this whole other issue, right? So theoretically, they're out going to go build an internal developer portal, and they're going to provide self-service capabilities to all these developers so they can go create applications and not worry about Kubernetes, but that's a work in progress at best. And then it brings up this whole question of, well, what is the future of DevOps in that context? Because a lot of folks would say, we embrace DevOps to get out from underneath centralized IT, and yet with the rise of Kubernetes and platform engineering, maybe we're headed back to centralized IT. So is there some way to strike a balance here in your mind?
Well, I think there is a freight train coming down the pike, and I'll table that for a second. But, the other thing about, when we first started playing with Docker, I was like the eighth person, and I sold a company to Docker, right? Like, I was like eighth, no, I wasn't eighth. That was Chef. I'm sorry. That was, I was like, I don't know, maybe 60th person. Sold a company to Docker, but I was into Docker real early, right? And I remember, like, the idea was, we could start creating ratios of 10 containers per VM, right? Or 20 containers per VM. Like, so there was going to be what seemed like a real positive scale opportunity. And that sort of like model or operating sort of model or theory really demanded orchestration. But a lot of people, I'd run into them early on and they'd say, oh no, we run one VM, one container. Like, what do you got in mind? Don't you understand Docker? Or, what's wrong with you? That's not that was not the vision. You broke the, you broke the mold, right? And the truth is, maybe they were right. And maybe the people who are responding that say they just run containers just stuck with that. And at the end of the day, it's all virtual anyway. So like, and if you're running on the cloud, you don't consume that overhead anyway of how many VMs per physical server, right? That was the other problem. We had this containment methodology, right? Like, okay, we went to virtualization to be able to run more sort of like operating systems per physical machine. Then we went to containers to run more sort of these, container operating systems per VM, right? And, we were supposed, but at the end of the day, if it's already virtualized and a provider's already assuming the cost for the overhead for virtualizing on physical machines, which they do really well, the Google, the Microsoft, and but on to like where are we going to go with DevOps? And, it is a little bit of diversion here, and we'll have to keep it quick, but I think we should have a whole topic on this. It's this idea of what they call autonomous dev tools is happening. And it is just, I really don't think pretty soon it's going to matter to anybody whether you're running. It's sort of like when you use ChatGPT, you're using under the covers a whole bunch of technologies. You care, you're using Kubernetes. What you're doing is driving somewhere. So these autonomous dev tools are going to be, hey, fix my problem, do this, install that, do this. And maybe Kubernetes is going to get installed as part of an instruction. You said, hey, I want to run a cluster of these services, and here's the code. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, what that person needs is a Kubernetes cluster with 3 pods, and right? And you're not, my sort of joke is, are we really going to need a conference where 5,000 people are going to be running around some large city trying to figure out where to put semicolons into YAML files? And I can tell you emphatically the answer is no, based on the stuff I'm doing with some of these autonomous dev tools. Open Devin, there's the Rancher guys created something called GPT script. Like these tools are just the stuff you can do with them by just having a natural language conversation. In fact, the last one is that I just got early access to Copilot Workspace from Microsoft. And it's literally a development. You point at an incident, it analyzes the incident, it gives you a task list for correcting the issue. Sorry, not incident, issue, GitHub issue. It gives you a task list. You can mutate it. You can then execute it, and it'll fix the problem.
And it's funny how related all these things are, right? Because everybody's talking about this Brocade bought VMware thing, and they changed the licensing terms, and suddenly there's a lot more interest in taking that VM and just encapsulating it into a container and running it on Kubernetes, and that gets you out from underneath VMware. So it's funny to me, though, none of these technologies seem to exist in isolation, and they all have relationships with each other, but I'm not quite clear that we ever think about it holistically enough.
I don't think, I think at the end of the day, like I said earlier, I think it's like we're not really going to care except for the fact that we need to be diligent about observing the potential opportunities of breaches and, adversaries taking example, of like this sort of the fact that what I don't think is going away. I think there's a world very soon where most software engineers are literally just using NLP, basically ChatGPT or some variant of a generative AI to do their work. Mm-hmm. I think we're already beyond Copilot. Like Copilot is like, hey, write me code that does this, this, and this. With things like Copilot Workspace or Open Devin or these tools, these are more like, hey, I want an application that is a web service. If you find it desirable, use Nginx, that kind of stuff, right? Like where I think we're going to be an abstraction removed away from like how we build software, how software engineers develop structure. So I that's happening. That whether you like it or not, it is happening as we speak. If you start tracking, there's something called this SWE, Software Engineer Leaderboard or Workbench, and you watch every week. There's somebody on it who's given a higher percentage of what these autonomous dev tools can do. And, when Open Devin, when Devin is sort of a joke. Sorry, I'll say it, but Open Devin is not a joke. When it started out 9% on this leaderboard, like they're up like the low 20s now percentage of what they can accomplish based on this workbench, what's called the SWE Workbench. Anyway, so that's happening. But the thing I worry about as being somebody who's always been on the sort of protector side is, how are we going to keep up with the infrastructure that's running all these things for us, which is a good thing. I don't want to have 1,000 people that know how to build YAML files in a 100,000 person bank. I don't that's not needed today, right? If your full-time job is creating configuration or YAML files, or I'm sorry to my good friends who I still love at Chef, no, there's no need for that now. The Terraform, that stuff will happen automatically. Here's my descriptor, make it so. And we're there. But the thing I worry about a lot is all the things that who's going to watch because all those technologies that will do that for you are all running common cloud native stacks.
All right, folks. Well, think about it this way. Maybe by Kubernetes' next birthday, its 11th, we'll be talking about how we applied AI to the management of Kubernetes and just rendered the whole thing moot. All right, we'll be back in a minute to talk about our next topic, but stay tuned.
Discover Techstrong Group, the epicenter of tech innovation. We're your go-to for reaching IT leaders and practitioners worldwide. Our secret? Impactful content that sparks awareness, engagement, and top-quality leads. With us, you'll access editorial websites, streaming videos, virtual events, custom content, analyst research, and more. Join our satisfied clients. Let's revolutionize your tech journey. Contact us today and tell your story to the world in the most powerful way with Techstrong Group.
All right, folks, and we're back, and we're talking about Cisco, and they had their big Cisco Live conference last week, and if you haven't noticed, it is conference season. There's about 3 of these every week, but Cisco is interesting because they have App Dynamics, and you're talking about first applying Gen AI to App Dynamics, but then they're going to extend that out to integrations with Splunk that they recently acquired, and they have Thousand Eyes for network monitoring. And of course, they have all these other tools that they use for the management of networking and security, not to mention all their server infrastructure. John, do you think that we're on the cusp of maybe bringing all these different frameworks and tools together in some sort of cohesive way that it makes it easier to manage things end to end? Cisco is making a bet that that's exactly what will happen, or are silos so entrenched that we'll never get there?
Yeah, I think we could be on the path to having these incredible integrations, but I think a lot of the vendors I'm talking to don't get how to operate in this new domain. And what I mean by that is, I think this idea, I've had a lot of startups come to me and say, hey, we're thinking about, integrating AI. And the first thing I say is, don't build your own LLM or Copilot. That's a bad idea. Because what the industry will not tolerate is, because think of this world where now a large bank's going to have Cisco's LLM, Salesforce LLM, or the Einstein. It's going to name every product that you got. And that's not even including things like Workbench and other HR tools, right? And that is going to be technical debt that is going to be, sort of orders of magnitude complex than anything you've seen before. I call it the upcoming technical debt tsunami, right? And so there's going to be a blockade at some point. All right, no more co-pilots, please, right? So if you're a vendor right now, and then like Cisco wouldn't ask for my opinion, and but the small guys come to me all the time, and I'm like, the new world is to basically. So what happens now is expect that all of the Copilot and sort of LLM magic is going to happen outside of your. So what you need to do is expose all your stuff as APIs. And so the new environment is, I sit in an environment where I have access to your information via command line, preferably APIs or an API gateway, or so not in the sort of classic gateway, but a new router model. Where if I'm Cisco, what I'm doing is I'm not trying to provide my customers a GUI. By the way, I don't think people are even going to use your GUI anymore. The new GUI is not going to go into your screen to see what histogram you show. The new GUI is having a question and answer with your product. Hey, which switches are behaving abnormally, for example, greater than this many milliseconds later. I'm making shit up, but the point being that, like, the new domain is assume that everybody's going to use you from a common architecture. And so I guess you're still today, whatever today's date is, June 7th, 2024, you still probably have to have a GUI because people are still like, hey, that AI stuff. But like, I would put all my oxygen into thinking about the new architectures of like these, sort of routers that work with APIs and data consumers that then feed into LLMs, that now I can basically integrate my conversations with whatever I need from you and everybody else. I'm working on a prototype right now. I mentioned these GPT script guys, right? I can set up an environment right now where I have access to my machine that has all my Amazon commands, it has all my Kubernetes commands, it has GitHub. And I sit there now and they integrate the LLM like a GPT-4o. And what happens is the things I run in my environment actually get put into the context window via functions. There's, a little technology here. But the magic is I can just ask questions like, tell me all my EC2 instances that are running with tag dev local 1. Okay, of all those instances, which ones are running Kubernetes and have pods that have this? I'm doing this right now, right? And can you tell me any issues related to these, 4 Kubernetes pods? Oh, can you go ahead and explain that? And then when you start like adding in things like, Copilot workspace, now I can say, oh, there's an issue. Can you go fix it? That's the world. If I'm Cisco or any of these vendors, I'm assuming very soon the architecture is not to have it encapsulated. I'm not ship my own LLM with my own vector database and all my orchestration. Think about all the technical debt for them. When the customer is going to have to build their own orchestration engines like LangChain or Llama Index, or right, and they're going to have their own vector database sources. They're going to have their own architecture. So the smart play is to integrate, start pushing your delivery, because Dynatrace and Splunk and all those tools and Thousand Eyes, maybe less Thousand Eyes, but are all going to be around. That technology is not going away. We need that information about our infrastructure or the infrastructures that we're running. But I just don't see a world where not only do I have 4 GUI, like think about Cisco right now. I got to have a GUI for Cisco. For App Dynamics, and I got to have a GUI for sort of Splunk. I have to have a GUI for Thousand Eyes, and now I'm going to have additional GUIs that are these copilots for some integrated version of those. Plus, I'll probably have a documentation rag built. So now, for one company, for like 3 products, I got 10 different GUIs. When right now, the assumption is I don't talk to GUIs. I talk to LLMs. And so I think...
So play that out a little bit for me, if you would. If we're going to talk to the LLM, do we need the GUI in the first place because it's just going to be maybe a verbal interface or speech? And then secondarily, am I going to have like a master AI agent that will talk to all the... other AI agents on my behalf to go execute something asynchronously, or do I have to talk to each one of these individually?
I think this will all evolve, but I think the you will not really need 100 GUIs, right? There are some models where when I say models, some sort of implementations where you might want to have like system of record data available. So then now you can see your natural language question maybe it's too much, or the answers have to be absolutely correct. So let me use the LLM data to get me to sort of a system of record answer of what to do, right? And so in that case, we still will have GUIs. But I think this idea of going to some navigation of screens to find out what the answer is of the performance of this service, like, okay, go here, I log into here, am I logged on? What about credentials? This. And then I go all the way down the stream and I say, oh, yeah, it looks like this is, but yeah, I need to go back to that other screen now, right? The future is more like, and it's still nascent, but this is going to happen. It's going to be, can you tell me any of the performance? It's like the thing I told you that I'm working on with just Amazon. Like, give me all my instances are running. Give me all my instances that have tag, that have a tag with dev local 1, right? I don't need to scroll through and, it just answers the question. And I can say, of those, which ones are running Kubernetes? People are going to expect the dialogue like that. Now, as far as the architecture, I think the simple architectures that, some of us are sort of designing and working on, there's a group of DevOps pioneers who have sort of been playing around with different ideas, helping some companies build this. But you'll have all your sort of API, like you might have an SQL API, you might have a database, you might have, a performance tool, an orchestration tool API, you just go down the list of all the different APIs you might have. And then you have some router technology, which is sort of part LLM, or it's, some of the orchestration tools like LangChain and Llama Index have these capabilities to do this type sort of semantic or intelligent, I know. I don't even have to set up a config. It says, I know they want to talk to the SQL agent. So, and then that will all load into, initially architectures like one LLM, but the truth of it is this army of LLMs that have different purposes. And then there's a front end on top of that. There's a RAG, there's a, vector database, there's a graph component of the data, so at some point, the architecture of these things will sort of be, and, this idea of sort of, some people call it army of bots or the army of LLMs or mixture of experts. And then on top of that, you'll have all this data, and then you'll have sort of agents who will now sort of have specific things to do. And this is all happening right now. People are building these incredibly sophisticated. Patrick DeVar is doing some incredible stuff with actually platforms and agents. And so all that stuff I'm talking about, this gets real scary. You'll have just agents that run. Once you have that architecture set up, they're just going to basically look for those problems all day long.
Well, and that's my next question to you. So right now, it requires a fair amount of intelligence on our side to go interrogate the systems to figure out what's going on. Are we going to get to the point where, we'll just come in the morning and the agents will tell us, here are the 3 things that are going wrong, and what do you want me to do about it?
Yeah, look at the evolution of being the sysadmin, right? If you go back before we had a lot of these tools that aggregated all that stuff, that's what we did. You came out, in the morning, you ran this command, that command, that command, that command. Oh, this command told you to run these 3 commands. You run that command, this command. You found something there, right? And in a lot of ways, these observability tools and stuff like that have built an abstraction where now we sort of come in and we look at, the red, whatever's pops up red, right? Or, if it's 24/7, it's a red that turns into a PagerDuty alert, right? This is just another evolution of that. Yeah, I think we're going to find that there are narrow scenarios where agents can do a lot of that. Now, there's always going to be the human in the middle, right? There's this sort of I'm a big believer, maybe just optimistically, that, the human is going to have to mitigate, because these things, as much as you can control them from hallucinations and, sort of bias, and they still will always have, and they will always drift, a little bit better, a little bit worse, a little bit better, a little bit worse. We're actually seeing this in the industry with some of the Google stuff right now. So I think that there's always going to have to be a human. It's just what the human has to do to make that arbitration. It's just a lot of that's going to go away.
At the end of the day, then, are we going to be able, people are saying, for instance, that we're going to have more applications built and deployed in the next 2 years than we had in the previous 2 decades. Are we on the cusp of that? And can we manage at that scale?
Well, that's another question. And I worry about the technical debt issue of all the hidden debt that comes from having all this. Like it's always, there's the sort of idea of there's oxygen in a balloon, you squeeze the oxygen, it goes somewhere else, right? It still stays in the balloon. I do think like this idea of like this, Jevons paradox is something, a topic point we've had in DevOps forever, right? Which is this idea of like the more easier you make, the more you make abstractions, the more you get. Like, and I always used everybody thought the video stores were going to put the theaters out. 10 years later, we went from like 2 theaters to 36 plexes, right? Like, so that's sort of an example of sort of Jevons paradox. I think all these abstractions are like going to create tighter feedback loops, which are actually going to produce more results. We're going to get more sort of feedback from our customers. I mean, I think, and the fact that we can code faster, we can build and implement, we can fix faster. I think we're going to see, business commerce, like, and again, like if you're worried about losing your job, change your job. But like, because, if you're a Java coder for a bank and you've been basically copying and pasting code for 25 years, you're not going to have a job. But if you've been in a bank and you've been innovating through your code on how to work with the business and innovate new ideas and, help the business and the PMs understand how to turn technology into business opportunities, then you're going to do better than you ever have.
True that. Hey, John, as always, enjoyed the chat immensely. We're giving everybody a glimpse of the future. Of course, the question is
our future. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, like, like I always say, if I'm in a line in the shopping, in the grocery store, do not get in that line. It will by default be the longest taking line. So just buyer beware.
All right. Well, they say cowboy wisdom, never confuse a good view for a short distance, but we'll see what happens. And hopefully we'll all be here to talk about it when it happens. Hey, everybody, thanks for watching the latest edition of the Techstrong Gang. Stay tuned for some of the awesome episodes we have in the rest of the show. And till then, we'll see you next episode of the Techstrong Gang, which should be tomorrow.